For decades, it kind of seemed like the European order was set in stone, built on these foundations laid right after World War II. But today, the very ground beneath those foundations is shifting, forcing an entire continent to face some new, really uncertain realities.
Okay, let's just dive right into the deep end here. We're asking a massive question. Is the Europe we've known for over 70 years, this Europe of an ever closer union and collective security, is it fundamentally changing course?
To really wrap our heads around this shift, you gotta think of post-war Europe as being held up by two giant pillars. The first pillar is all about economic integration, and that's embodied by the European Union. The second pillar? That's collective security, guaranteed by NATO. For years and years, these two were the absolute bedrock of stability.
But then, a seismic event happened that sent a huge crack running right through that first pillar. Let's talk about Brexit and the profound challenge it threw right at that economic order.
This quote from Giorgio Sacerdoti just perfectly nails the central contradiction of the UK's whole position at the start. The idea was to somehow keep this deeply integrated economic relationship going, while at the same time leaving the very thing that made it all possible, the EU's single market. It was a classic case of wanting to have your cake and eat it too.
And this slide, well, it lays out the deadlock in black and white. On the left, you see what the UK wanted: super smooth, frictionless trade, plus the freedom to make its own deals. And on the right, you see the EU's non-negotiables. You can't just cherry-pick the good parts of the single market, and if you're not a member, you don't get member benefits. You can see right away how these two sides were just completely incompatible.
So let's be super clear about what the UK rejected here. The single market is built on what they call the four freedoms: the movement of goods, services, capital, and people. And that last one, controlling the movement of people, well, that was the absolute deal-breaker that led the UK to walk away from the whole thing.
The UK also decided against staying in the customs union. So why was that? Well, because if you're in it, you have to apply the same tariffs to goods from outside the group. And that would have made it impossible for the UK to go out and sign its own independent free trade agreements, which was, a huge part of the whole Brexit promise.
So the economic pillar was definitely cracking. But here's the kicker. At the very same time, the second pillar, the security one, NATO, was starting to come under its own really intense stress. This quote really captures the feeling at the time. All of a sudden, the future felt really uncertain. You had questions about America's commitment to its old allies, which forced some once unthinkable questions to the front of everyone's mind. Could Europe really still rely on the US, and did it need to figure out how to defend itself?
And this brings us to one stark number, 4%. This is what some analysts were saying European nations would have to spend on defense if they wanted to achieve true strategic autonomy. For most of them, that would mean a massive increase in spending, which just goes to show how much the continent had come to rely on that American security guarantee.
So you can see the pressure on NATO was coming from all sides. You had the US pushing for members to spend more, you had serious doubts about whether that long-term American commitment was still solid, and all of that led to a growing call from inside Europe to finally build up the ability to act alone, just in case.
All of this, it begs a pretty serious question. What happens if these pillars don't just crack, but they actually crumble? Let's take a second and explore what that could look like. Okay, first, let's stick with the economic side and imagine a no-deal Brexit. This was that cliff-edge scenario that everyone was desperately trying to avoid.
So what would no deal have actually meant? Basically, the old system would have just vanished overnight. Trade would snap back to basic World Trade Organization rules. All of a sudden, you'd have EU tariffs on UK goods, and new customs controls would pop up, bringing that whole idea of frictionless trade to a grinding halt.
Now, let's look at the parallel nightmare scenario on the security side, a total collapse of the NATO alliance. What would that world actually look like?
Honestly, the fallout would be catastrophic. It could embolden rivals like Russia and China, while the US would lose its strategic footing in Europe. And right here is where you see that the two pillars are fundamentally linked. A security collapse could instantly threaten the massive trillion-dollar trade relationship between the US and Europe.
But, crises can also force change and open up new possibilities. So, in the middle of all these challenges, are we seeing new paths being forged in this new reality?
It seems like two very different paths are emerging. On one hand, you have the UK going down its own independent road, focused on signing new trade deals all over the world, deals it says can be better suited to the UK. And on the other hand, You have Europe starting to seriously explore its own path, talking more about boosting its own defense and working together on military stuff.
But, and this is a big but, the old realities are still very much in play. This line from the EU's own negotiating playbook is a really stark reminder. It basically says that any new trade deal can be ambitious, but it can never be the same as actually being in the single market. The red lines are still there, and they're very clear.
And this all leads us to the final, crucial question. As these old post-war alliances start to fray and change, what comes next? Is Europe going to forge a stronger, more independent future out of all this? Or are we heading into a more fragmented and maybe even more dangerous world? The truth is, that story is still being written.